Hello, and welcome to the Historic Preservation Training for the Iowa Economic Development Authority's Community Development Block Grant Reviews. This is one portion of a comprehensive environmental review training being offered by the Iowa Economic Development Authority. My name is Ann Schmid, and I serve as the architectural historian for IEDA, as well as the disaster recovery team leader. Today we will be discussing Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and how it relates to our programs and how we document compliance. The National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966. That law created many preservation things, including state historic preservation offices, tribal historic preservation offices, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is a federal agency that oversees all other agencies' compliance with the Act, the National Register of Historic Places, our nation's repository of information on historic and cultural resources, the National Historic Landmarks Program, the certification of local governments, enabling local governments to establish historic preservation commissions, and Section 106 of the Act specifically relates to federally funded projects. Section 106 states, the head of any federal agency having direct or indirect jurisdiction over a proposed federal or federally assisted undertaking in any state, or the head of any federal department or independent agency having the authority to license or an undertaking shall, prior to the approval of the expenditure of federal funds on an undertaking or prior to the issuance of a license, as the case may be, take into account the effect of the undertaking on any district, site, building, structure, or object that is included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register. So that one short paragraph is what requires all of our projects to consider the effect of the project on cultural resources or historic structures. Today, we will go through all of the requirements of compliance for this law and the way that we at IEDA have structured our compliance documentation. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has taken the paragraph and provided federal agencies for a four-point approach to compliance. We will go through each one of these steps as they relate to our CDBG or CDBG-DR projects. The first step is to initiate the 106 review, to identify if you have projects that have the potential to affect cultural resources. The second, and really the largest component of the Section 106 process, is the identification and evaluation of historic properties. You must do this by identifying an area of potential effects, including sites within, adjacent to, or directly or indirectly related to the undertaking that could be affected by your project, and then evaluating resources within that area to see if they are either currently listed on or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. The third step is to assess those effects, to consult with the State Historic Preservation Office and all interested parties on how your project could affect those resources that you've identified. And lastly, if the project results in an adverse effect to projects, you must resolve those adverse effects by generating a memorandum of agreement to outline agreed upon measures that would allow the federal agency to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the results of the undertaking. So we'll go through each of these steps in a step-by-step process to ensure compliance. So the first question to initiate the process, you have to consider, is this the type of project that has the potential to affect cultural resources? I've provided some examples here. Construction activities on buildings that are over 50 years old, that include ground disturbance, and that may have an impact on a structure, land, or have a visual view shed of building sites, districts, or objects that are more than 50 years old. Absolutely, yes, that triggers 106. Planning activities with no construction component, no. Or activities that HUD has specifically identified as categorically excluded, not subject to the regulations at 58.5. That would be found in the HUD regulation 24 CFR 58. The other option is to use a programmatic agreement that is in place between the responsible entity or IEDA and the local and the State Historic Preservation Office to expedite or streamline this process. Your project may fall under an allowance or an exempt activity, meaning that you don't have to fully consult with the SHPO or their designee through a PA, or prepare consultation materials on a project that without a PA in place you otherwise would need to. It's very important to be familiar with a programmatic agreement if you plan to use one. Make sure it is current, up to date, and can only be used by the agency that is funding the project or issuing the permit. In our case, here at IEDA, we historically had processed under a programmatic memorandum of understanding. That document is no longer in use. And since August of 2016, we have worked under an executed programmatic agreement between IEDA, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and the state and the Iowa State Historic Preservation Office. This document is what you should reference for all CDBG funded projects and CDBG disaster recovery, except for those funded under the 2008 disaster recovery program. Here's an image of that programmatic agreement and a link for you to find it on our website. It was executed by all parties and provides great information about the roles and responsibilities of all parties involved in Section 106. For any grant administrator or community considering a federal project, I highly encourage you to read this document to get a full sense of your role and responsibility in the process. Some activities included in the programmatic agreement may be considered excluded, where you don't have to do extensive due diligence to document and evaluate resources. Typical excluded activities would be for ground disturbance, areas that were previously surveyed and no archaeological sites were identified, or where you can document profound disturbance. Perhaps the area has been fully disturbed by a prior action and therefore no potential for historic resources exists. For buildings, properties that are less than 50 years old and therefore not likely to be eligible for the National Register could be excluded, or projects that have been evaluated in the past 5 years and determined not eligible. There are also specific excluded activities such as caulking or weather stripping that does not permanently damage materials, or non-destructive testing for lead, the installation of storm windows, things that could be documented as minimally affecting the property. Those can be approved without further documentation. At IEDA, as part of our programmatic agreement, we have an excluded from review form. This form would be completed describing a project. We recommend that instead of just saying rehab, provide something more informational, like replace wood double hung windows or install new vinyl siding. You would want to provide your project information, location as detailed as possible. And then the most important part is to select or cite which component of the programmatic agreement you are using. So if your property were less than 50 years old, you would say PA Appendix B, Section 3A, less than 50, building built in 1976. If the area has been previously surveyed for archaeology, you could say PA Section 2A, APA previously surveyed in 2013. You'll want to include a signature and a date, as this information will be entered in the Iowa grant system when we receive the uploaded version of this form. Once the form is complete, you would initiate a Section 106 Tier 2 compliance form in iowogrants.gov. Under the question PA exempt, you would select yes from the drawdown. You would select the correct drop-downs for which exclusion you're using, as we talked about on the previous form, and then you would upload the form and submit it through iowogrants.gov. The IEDA Historic Preservation Specialist, as outlined in our programmatic agreement with the State Historic Preservation Office, will review, and if everything is correct, will approve. Once approved, proceed depending on the level of environmental review, either include in your environmental review record for an environmental assessment, or proceed with the project if this is a tiered review or something that is categorically excluded subject to. I should take a moment here and talk a little bit more about that 2016 programmatic agreement that we have with our State Historic Preservation Office. I mentioned that it outlines the roles and responsibilities of all parties involved. One of those unique roles is that IEDA has qualified on-site staff that can conduct historic preservation reviews. So unlike other federal agencies who are required to submit their Section 106 documentation directly to the Iowa State Historic Preservation Office, we here at IEDA, through our programmatic agreement designation, have the ability to collect, review, and process those reviews in-house at Iowa Economic Development Authority. We do so with qualified staff that meet the same requirements as those staff that would work at a State Historic Preservation Office. Furthermore, we report annually all of the projects that we have reviewed and approved to the State Historic Preservation Office to ensure that evaluations are included in the state's inventory. Moving on, we will talk about that large part of Section 106, the identification and evaluation of historic properties. So if you have a project that does not meet one of the PA exclusions and does trigger Section 106 compliance, we move on to step 2, the identification and evaluation of historic properties. What is a historic property? The process that we will go through, as outlined by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, leans heavily on documentation generated by the Federal Department of the Interior. The National Park Service oversees many of the requirements that we will talk about today, including the National Register of Historic Places. A historic property is any resource that is listed on or found to be eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. This includes buildings, districts, structures, objects, and sites, including archaeological sites. How do we identify historic properties? Well, the first thing we need to do is develop an area of potential effects to see what resources are within that area. Then we check the National Register database to see what's already listed. We check with the state inventory to see what's already in the state inventory but may not be listed on the National Register. And then lastly, we have to evaluate previously unevaluated resources. This is a screenshot of the National Register of Historic Places database. So one place where you might go to check to see if a property is listed on the National Register. But as I said, the most important thing to do is start by identifying your area of potential effects. According to federal regulation, the area of potential effects is the geographic area or areas within any undertaking which may be directly or indirectly used to cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties, if any such properties exist. The area of potential effects is influenced by the scale and nature of the undertaking and may be different for different kinds of effects caused by undertakings. I know that can be a little bit cumbersome and wordy, but what they're getting at here is that not every project is the same. If we have a project that is only the interior rehabilitation of buildings, so nothing on the outside, no windows, simply just interior, maybe electrical and plumbing repairs on the inside. Well, the area of potential effects is limited to just that house because nothing that I do within that house could affect neighboring properties. However, if we have a program that is specifically limited to the exterior of the house, we now have the potential to affect our neighboring properties based on view shed or the context within a historic district. So you see how even though our two programs were just rehabilitation, changing it from interior to exterior changes where we look for our area of potential effects. All projects must have a defined area of potential effects. The responsible entity determines the APE based on the nature of the undertaking. As you've probably heard in some of Ed's earlier environmental regulations, HUD has the unique authority to designate down the role of federal responsible entity to the recipient of funds. Therefore, the community in which our CDBG or CDBG-DR program is taking place has the job to identify that area of potential effects. The APE is then used to determine what must be evaluated for NRHP eligibility. As you look at an area of potential effects, it's important to consider all properties in the APE as you move forward with the identification and evaluation. Look left and right of your project location. In this case, our project is located here. Our project may be the construction of new infill housing. Well, that certainly has the potential to affect adjacent properties. Therefore, it's important for us to identify all of the red bounded properties are those that have been previously determined eligible, or maybe determined eligible through this Section 106 consultation process. Consider your project within the context of a neighborhood, commercial core, campus, plant, etc. Properties can be both individually eligible for the National Register or contributing within a historic district, which we will talk about in just a moment. Area of potential effects should also consider the full project that you have. Don't limit your APE to only resources receiving federal funds. Effects can be direct, physical changes, indirect, viewshed, setting, downstream changes. They can be immediate, occur at the time of the undertaking, or they can be further removed, results from an undertaking that may take weeks, months, or even years to occur. In this example, I was originally provided this rectangle and told that the construction for the CDBG project would be limited to this agricultural area. But when I learned that it would be connected to an existing utility system, I had to ask the question of how will that connection occur? At first, I was told that other funds would be used, but as we look at the Historic Preservation Act, it requires us to connect all the links, to look at the whole picture, to look at the area of potential effects as could we do this project but for the connection to the existing utility? Therefore, the APE must include the full area that will be impacted by the project. Think about all the possible effects as you define your APE. As I mentioned earlier, downstream effects may be something you have to consider that aren't immediately within the construction area of your project. Again, going back to this slide about what are historic properties and how do we identify them. Once we've established our area of potential effects, then we start checking all of those resources, the National Register database, the state inventory. And then lastly, as I said, we are responsible for evaluating previously unevaluated properties. The National Register of Historic Places has very specific criteria that are, as I said earlier, established by the National Park Service. There are 4 eligibility criteria for the National Register of Historic Places, with a minimum threshold of properties being 50 years old or older. There are some exceptional significances that we can discuss on a case-by-case basis, but in general, properties eligible for the National Register are over 50 years old. They may be, criteria A, are resources associated with an event that made a significant contribution to our history. Oftentimes we think of a singular event like a parade or a tragic event, a fire, but events can also be associated with the development of a community, the founding of a town, things that changed the built environment as that event occurred, either in short time or longer. Criteria B are resources associated with the lives of significant persons. Criterion C, and probably the most common one that I see for our CDBG projects, are resources that embody distinctive characteristics or significant type, period, style, or method of construction and architecture. We think of this one as the architecture criteria, the design criteria. And D, does the resource yield or is likely to yield important information about our nation's history or prehistoric times? This criteria is typically reserved for archaeology, so looking at discovering ways that historic or prehistoric inhabitants of our land used resources. In Iowa, we complete an Iowa Site Inventory form to document our evaluation for these resources. This allows you to document whether a property is eligible or if you've determined that it's not eligible. The form is your tool for making that determination. When we look at previously unevaluated historic properties, we want to look at existing conditions and maybe compare them to historic photographs if we have of the time of construction to really document any changes or alterations that have been made over time. We need to document deterioration of materials or substantial visible changes that have occurred, such as, window infill or additions or modifications to buildings. We need to include a good map of the property for the location. And it's always a great idea if you can get access to any historic images, maps, or any other information that would help document the age of the structure and the integrity of the building. We'll talk a little bit more about integrity. The National Park Service requires that we document the period of significance, the time in which for an eligible property we've determined that it is significant. If a property is eligible, you document the date range for when it has achieved significance. Typically, for properties eligible for architecture or workmanship, the period of significance is the date of construction. For properties associated with a significant person, the period of significance is likely the date that that significant person used or lived in the property. And then typically, for properties eligible for the association of a significant event, the period of the significant event would be the period of significance. This can be a single event, as I said, like a speech, a rally, a convention, a tragic event, an accident, that may be 1 to 3 days, or it can be a longer event, such as the period of development and growth of a commercial corridor, maybe as much as 20 to 50 or more years. Integrity. As I said, we want to compare historic images to current images to know if the building has integrity. Does it retain sufficient information to be eligible for the National Register? The Park Service has established 7 aspects of integrity that we look at, comparing the building as it is today to as it was during its potential period of significance. The location. Has the building been moved or is it in the same location where it was built? Design. Does it show the same design characteristics now as it did when it was built? Setting. Has the setting substantially changed? Has new development encroached on it and changed the setting around it? Materials. Does it express the same historic materials does it have, or has it been altered, modified, changed with replacement materials? Workmanship. Does it have a high level of craftsmanship or workmanship that's expressed through those materials? Feeling and association. Do we still have the same recognition as it would at the time? Can someone who had lived during the period of significance recognize the property today? I get the question a lot, does the property retain integrity? Oftentimes we look at specific modifications to buildings within the context of the type of projects we generally fund with CDBG. We look at overlay and replacement siding, vinyl siding, metal siding, slip covers. We look at replacement windows and doors. We look at non-sympathetic roof replacements, single seam metal roof on a residential property, significant additions, attachments of garages, enclosed porches, removal of porch, large front addition. Generally, my comments on these is that one of these things does not automatically disqualify a property for the National Register. A combination of these things diminishes the integrity, and you have to get to a point where the integrity is diminished such that it no longer conveys those craftsmanship, feeling, association that it would have at the time. So what I typically advise is if you have 3 or more strikes, that's probably the threshold for no longer retaining integrity. But when I say that, I really mean like 3 or more large modifications, not just 3 rear windows have been replaced. That would not reach the level. But if it has had all the windows replaced and overlay siding and the replacement of the doors, then we'd be talking about lack of integrity. The important thing here is to document those changes in the Iowa Site Inventory form. I've been seeing many forms lately that have a great section now where they talk about the modifications to the building, and I think that's really important to help us substantiate whether a property does or does not retain integrity. Things that likely do not change the integrity of a property: painting a different color. Certainly if a homeowner wants to paint their house neon blue, it's not going to change the integrity of the materials there, especially if they're materials that were intended to be painted. Now, painting brick or previously unpainted brick could have some integrity issues. But if we're talking about wood siding and it is painted a specific color, that's not going to be a problem. Storm doors and windows that can be removed without damaging the original. I oftentimes see a lot of projects where they have maybe 1970s aluminum storm windows, and folks just assume that the whole window has been replaced and it diminishes integrity. But storm windows are very easily reversible, so we don't consider those to damage the integrity of the property. And then deteriorated or deferred maintenance: chipped peeling paint, old roof, cracked window glass. Those are all things that, sure, they show deterioration and the need for investment, but they do not diminish the integrity of the resource. Poor condition was not one of those aspects of integrity. So, our job is really to look past the deterioration and see if that historic material is still intact and can be retained and preserved. Remember, evaluation is needed for all the resources within your area potential effects: buildings, districts, objects, structures, and sites. So if you have a project like our Downtown Revitalization Fund, where your particular building is located in a commercial corridor, or maybe your house is located in a residential area that was all developed at the same time under the same plat and development team, then it is our job through the Historic Preservation Act to look left and right and to say, do we have a historic district here? And not only do I need to evaluate my property, I need to evaluate the potential for a historic district, since that is within my area of potential effects. So district evaluation is not just limited to those Downtown Revitalization Fund projects. It applies to all types of projects. It may require a windshield survey where you just look at the exterior of properties, surrounding properties and streetscapes, maybe images, thumbnail photographs of surrounding buildings for an assessment. It's important to look at historic aerial maps or Sanborn maps so that you can get a sense of what did develop around the same time and what is new infill. Try to find historic photographs to show if areas retain sufficient integrity. Include a map of the area that you evaluated. Include a table with addresses, dates of constructions, property types, and the recommendation of eligibility, so contributing or non-contributing. And include a narrative statement of the survey method and determination. District evaluation can also be recorded on an Iowa Site Inventory form, the same tool that we assess individual buildings we use for districts as well. When I look at a historic district, I look at the historic photographs that I can collect through the community, and I compare it to the existing condition. So if you see this 4-building block, I find the historic photographs and I see that the window openings retain sufficient integrity for their masonry openings, the setback is consistent, the feel of the district is there. This helps me confirm that the district itself retains sufficient integrity to be considered eligible for the National Register. So when do you need to consider district evaluation? When your structure that you are using federal funds on is located in an area of similarly constructed resources, built at the same time, similar design, same plat development, commercial corridor, connected use, such as an industrial plant or a campus of any kind. When the structure that you're using federal funds on is located in an area of connected use, you need to consider that surrounding and evaluate it as a district. For historic properties, there are two levels of district surveys. One is a reconnaissance, as I mentioned, a windshield. The other is intensive. It includes all of the general information, but then also a higher level of description, history, significance, and integrity of the resources within the survey area. So again, intensive would look at the individual properties. The reconnaissance would just give a windshield view. As I said, here in Iowa, we use the Iowa Site Inventory form. There's some links here to make sure that you can access that. In Iowa, the State Historic Preservation Office is found in the Department of Cultural Affairs, and therefore they handle all of the documentation for the state's inventory. This is just a slide to help you. I would hope that you would come back to this slide as you fill out an Iowa Site Inventory form to make sure that you're hitting all of those highlighted fields. Those are the required fields for information that we must have in order to document if a property is eligible or not eligible for the National Register. The instructions for this form are available again through the Department of Cultural Affairs. It's very important that not only are the fields on the form filled out, but also the continuation pages. These need to include a narrative description of the property, where you use text to describe the physical condition of the building, the style of the building, the materials used on the building, the size, scale, and unique features of the building. And then the narrative statement of significance would be used to make your case as to if the building is or is not National Register eligible. Continuation pages are also the appropriate place to include any current photographs of the resource, any historic images you've been able to find, maps, floor plans, renderings, sketches, drawings of the building, any archival material. The inventory form should be limited to the evaluation of the resource as it stands today. The inventory form is not the place to put any information about the proposed federal action. That comes in step 3 of this process. We are only in the identification and evaluation of resources. So we are looking at the resource as it stands today, and we are documenting if that resource is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. A couple of tips for this. I would really encourage you to try to use as clear, straightforward photographs as you can. These are all examples from inventory forms that have been submitted to me for review. Certainly this photograph in the lower right is, not helpful at all. I can't really get any sense of what this property looks like. This, even though the property itself appears to be very deteriorated, at least I, as the reviewer, can see the condition of the buildings much clearer. Now, there are always challenges with taking photographs, and I'll provide a couple of hints to help you along the way. There are also lots of great resources out there. These are some of my favorite books or publications that are available. You can Google any of these, but the Field Guide to American Houses provides excellent examples to give you those descriptive words on how to describe a roof style or a house shape or any of the architectural details for the different types of dormers or windows or arches that may be included on your structure that you're writing about. A few tips for photographing houses. Try to get at least one image that is the full front of the house. I understand that's not always possible, as we saw in that previous example, but do your best, even at an angle, to try and show the primary facade, the front entrance to the home. With these grants, where we have a sense of knowing who's applying for the program or who wants to be in the program, it's important you do have some time as you put together your materials. Try to photograph in late fall or winter or early spring before the leaves have blossomed that may block any view. So if you do have a tree in the way that does drop its leaves, try to consider photographing it at a better time of year. So obviously this picture was taken in full summer. That exact same house in the fall has a substantially different view, and I have a much clearer sense of what the structure is that I'd be looking at. Try to locate or ask the property owner for any historic images before trees or bushes may have been as tall as they are today. This is a copy of the county assessor's page. You can see just in the 10 years from 1999 to 2009 how much these trees have grown up, but I still know that the house is the same and I'm able to compare many of the features. And so by looking at the older image, I'm able to get a better sense of the structure itself. Consider lighting and time of day. Try not to take pictures that don't result, or try to take pictures that don't result in a glare or hot spots. Here, the being backlit, it's very hard to see the architectural details of the home. And then try to keep orientation consistent on the page. This is very difficult for a reviewer, especially as we work on electronic reviews and we're not just turning paper in our hands anymore. The longer it takes for me to get through the review, the greater delay it is for my ability to review and approve these for our applicants. So just keep in mind, making the packet as consistent and well prepared makes the review go more smoothly. These are just a couple of slides to show really nice ways to capture buildings. You can capture two facades, the front and a side, if you shoot from a corner angle, again, taking into consideration lighting and those kinds of things. But if you have an obstruction of a tree in the front, try shooting from the multiple angles to make sure that you are conveying the information about the building while taking into consideration those trees or shrubberies that may be blocking from a direct straightforward view. We also we need to include streetscapes. This is part of that discussion about whether or not a resource exists within a historic district. There are many times that I've asked for streetscapes and I've gotten photographs like this. This is a picture of a street. It does not help me inform the context in which a house is located. So don't provide pictures of streets, but a better example is a picture of a streetscape where I can see the neighboring properties. I can see what is across the street from or surrounding, and obviously this streetscape shows high integrity for a potential historic district. This is an image of a process chart that comes right out of our programmatic agreement, which allows the Iowa Economic Development Authority, Historic Preservation Specialist, the review and approval authority for our reviews. As a recipient of our funds or a grant administrator working with our recipient, you're looking to document either no potential to affect, no historic properties affected, or no adverse effect for your projects. So as you work through this chart, you ultimately end up with a submittal to IEDA for review. One thing that we've noticed is that many times Iowa Site Inventory Forms, that tool that we use for the evaluation of resources within our area of potential effects, need a professional opinion or a professional review. They're prior to coming to IEDA in order to streamline and improve the review process. IEDA has contracted with a technical assistance firm to provide a review and comment of inventory forms prior to the submittal to IEDA. This improves the quality of the forms and it helps to eliminate confusion or projects being sent back for editing or correcting status because they were insufficient to document if a property was eligible or not to the National Register. Leah Rogers with Tallgrass is our consultant for that, and this is the phase in which, in the process, you would contact Leah. Tallgrass Archaeology LLC provides both archaeology and historic preservation standing structures reviews. Here is the email and website for them, as well as a phone number contact for Tallgrass. The technical assistance is currently open to any current and future CDBG Housing Award, HSG award. What we ask for you is that you prepare that Iowa site inventory form based on the form, the instructions, and the guidance of this training, as you would. And then you send the draft of your form to Leah Rogers at Tallgrass, and she will go ahead and conduct a review, provide comments, and get feedback to you within 10 working days. You can submit your forms to her by email using a shared link, a Dropbox. I know these forms are large, and the best thing to do is reach out to Leah directly to coordinate the best way so that she receives it and knows that it's coming. Once Leah has recommended the changes, the grant administrator will incorporate those changes into the form prior to submitting your Section 106 review to IEDA. IEDA will conduct their review and provide comments in a timely fashion. One thing I want to note about this process is that Leah is commenting strictly on the evaluation of the resources, whether or not a property is eligible for the National Register. It is still up to the responsible entity and their grant administrator to ensure that the effects assessment that we'll talk about in step 3 is documented appropriately and identifying that correct scope of work. So again, using the Historic Preservation Technical Assistance, complete your Iowa Site Inventory form, send it to Tallgrass for review and comment, update based on comments, make sure your form is consistent with your project scope and finding, and then submit through IEDA. We will get into the submittal and consultation process towards the end of this presentation. For complex historic properties, we do offer the opportunity for Tallgrass to conduct the full evaluation. However, you must reach out to her in advance, and you must identify this as a full evaluation. I have been hearing from our consultant that there are responsible entities or grant administrators who are starting a form but not providing any narrative description or statement of significance and expecting Tallgrass to fill out the form entirely. This is not acceptable. Unless you are requesting a full evaluation, you must generate a draft form for her to comment and edit. If it's a full evaluation, Tallgrass will probably ask for some basic information, potentially make a site visit, and will generate a full inventory form. This is a separate service that comes at a different cost to IEDA, so you must distinguish full evaluation from edit and comment on an inventory form. And again, you'll want to make sure that your scope of work is consistent with your findings and submit through Iowa grants, which again, we will cover shortly. I wanted to take a brief minute to talk a little bit about archaeological evaluation. We spend a lot of time on standing structures because that's what many of our projects impact with our community development block grant funds. However, anytime we have a project that includes ground disturbance, we must also take reasonable measures to identify the presence or potential presence of historic resources, including buried archaeological sites. The scope and scale of disturbance will inform the level of investigation required. Projects with minor disturbance may be able to provide supplemental information, which we will talk about shortly, to make a determination that there's no compelling evidence to warrant further review. We get this language from HUD Fact Sheet number 6, which is included in Appendix D of the Programmatic Agreement. HUD is providing tools to say that in not all circumstances do we have to prove the negative of the unknown for archaeology, that we must only have to do a survey when there's compelling evidence that shows us the likelihood or probability of archaeological resources. If a project has substantial ground disturbance and there is information that leads to that probability for archaeology, then a survey must be completed. The responsible entity should procure a qualified archaeologist to complete a survey. In Iowa, archaeological investigations must comply with the Association of Iowa Archaeologists guidelines and must be completed for a qualified archaeologist. I often see out-of-state archaeologists attempting to do survey work in Iowa, and they don't have the same reference tools as, or they're not as familiar with the Iowa guidelines. If you are going to use an out-of-state archaeologist for cost-effective reasons, just be sure that you reference those Iowa archaeologist guidelines and make sure that your consultant is familiar with them. There have been instances where archaeology surveys or reports have had to be completed over again because the initial firm was not sufficiently qualified or sufficiently familiar with the Iowa requirements. If an initial investigation results in a recommendation by that archaeologist for continued investigation, perhaps there was not enough information to determine a site not eligible, then it would be required to continue that process for the full identification and evaluation of resources. The other option may be if an archaeological survey identified a site but was unable to evaluate it, it may be possible to modify the scope of work to fully avoid any unevaluated areas. As I mentioned before, there are times when we have ground disturbance, but the disturbance may be minimal, and we're able to use supplemental information to support our Section 106 consultation documents. For that, we may want to rely on information we gather from Google Maps or other online mapping systems. The state has very good resources for historic aerial maps by decade. We can use the General Land Office survey maps. Sanborn fire insurance maps are great for dating properties or showing change in land use over time. We can also use web soil surveys to identify soils that may have higher probability for archaeological deposits. Topographic maps, or even the iSites Public or the Office of the State Archaeologist site file search are great ways to inform the probability for archaeological resources. We want to be sure that when we're using online map tools that they're providing good information. So when I talk about supplemental information, I don't want Section 106 consultation materials to just be a checklist that you told me to get a map, so I got a map and provided. If it is heavily pixelated or doesn't provide information or isn't legible or doesn't tell anything about the project site, then it's not worth including. This is a great example because we have very clear mapping. We can definitely see the streets, and we can see, the condition of the area. So if my ground disturbance was occurring in this area, I would have a good sense of what that looked like based on this map. Furthermore, we can use the state's database for historic aerial maps, topographic maps, and LIDAR. We can use the web soil survey, again, to find the soils, and we can use the State of Iowa Library Services for Sanborn fire insurance maps. This is just a sample of how I've put together archaeological figures in the past, where I've used these supplemental maps. I've identified where my disturbance is going to be, and then I've written out a narrative about why I believe that there is no further compelling evidence that would require an archaeological survey. As such, when you have this level of information, you're able to make that determination. If you don't go through the documentation process, you can't just say, I don't think there's archaeology there. You have to say, there was no historic buildings there, or there was no, the river meandered nearby, or whatever it is your justification is. So as we look at tips for successful evaluation of resources, you want to begin to consider all potential properties and sites within the APE as early in project planning as possible. You want to coordinate with those actually interacting with the property. So this may be the inspectors, the property owners. They might have additional information that would help you in your evaluation of resources. Try to document the actual existing condition. The person writing the inventory form should also be familiar with the house and not just using photographs that someone else took to write up the form. If the property may be National Register eligible, gather additional information such as interior photographs, historic, anything historic images, the history of ownership to help make final determinations. The responsible entity must make the determination. For all properties, either never previously evaluated or evaluated more than 5 years ago, the responsible entity must make a determination of National Register eligibility using an Iowa site inventory form. You should use best available data to make your determination. It should be based on current existing conditions of the property, not how the property used to be or how the property will be changed by the result of the project, but how the property is today. If, based on initial review, the determination is not clear, the responsible entity is advised to seek professional assistance from a qualified consultant. All identification of prehistoric archaeological sites must consider the results of tribal consultation for eligibility determinations. Now, once we've identified that area of potential effects, we've identified all potential resources within that area, and we've evaluated those resources. Now we move on to step 3, assessing the effects of our undertaking. How will the project that we are funding affect cultural resources? There are 4 specific federal findings here. No potential to cause effect. No consultation is required, or we document through an exempt form. No historic properties affected. We will consult. Because of our programmatic agreement, you'd be consulting with the Iowa Economic Development Authority Historic Preservation Specialist. No adverse effect to historic properties. You would consult, again, with IEDA's Historic Preservation Specialist. An adverse effect to historic properties. In this case, we would revert back to consultation with the State Historic Preservation Officer. The responsible entity, again, makes this determination. This is called the selection of a federal finding. How do you assess those effects? For no historic properties affected, there are no historic properties within your area of potential effects. You've drawn your map, you've looked at your resources, nothing is eligible for the National Register. Your finding is no historic properties affected. No adverse effect to historic properties. In this case, you've defined your APE and there are eligible resources within your project area, but your project has been designed in a way to avoid adverse effects. It meets the Secretary of the Interior standards. It doesn't diminish the qualities that make the resources National Register eligible. Adverse effect. There are historic properties in the area of potential effect, and there is no way to avoid altering the characteristics or defining features of those historic properties. I want to talk a little bit about the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, as this is the primary means of complying with a no adverse effect finding. There are 10 standards for rehabilitation. I'm going to highlight the 4 that I think most often are critical to our CDBG and CDBG-DR projects, but all 10 are important, and you should be familiar with all of them, especially as you define a scope of work to meet the standards. So standard 2 is the historic character of the property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces shall be avoided. Number 4, most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. So in this case, even if the property was built in 1890, if it has a 1910s edition, the components of that 1910s edition may not disqualify it from the National Register. They could actually contribute to its significance, and therefore those components should also be retained. Deteriorated historic fabric shall be repaired rather than replaced. And then the chemical or physical treatment, such as sandblasting, that causes damage to historic materials shall not be used. So when we talk about no adverse effect to historic properties, we want to make sure that the scope of work is in line with those standards that we just presented. We want to work under a do no harm concept. So in step 2, we evaluated properties and determined them National Register eligible based on how they are. In step 3, we're assessing how our project could affect those. From a do no harm perspective, if the building at the time that it was evaluated had non-original, non-compatible windows, we would do no harm to the building by replacing those non-compatible, non-original windows. We would cause harm if those windows were original to the building and we proposed replacing them with non-compatible windows. So we have to look at what we have to start with, and we either have to have an in-kind swap or make the property better from a historic preservation perspective. Meaning if it had a undersized window at the time it was evaluated but still determined eligible, if we are looking at a replacement window, we could replace that undersized window, or we could enlarge the opening to the historic opening, but we could not infill that window and board it up, because that would be causing more harm than the undersized window that exists. So it's a spectrum of doing no harm based on the current condition and what we're proposing in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior's standards. I like to use retain, repair, and replace as the way to look at historic building material. You want to retain as much original fabric as possible. Where you cannot fully retain, or if something is broken or deteriorated, you want to repair it in kind. Perhaps you replace a component of it. Perhaps you replace a piece of glass and not the whole window frame. And then ultimately replace would be your last choice. In order to replace, you need to document that things are deteriorated beyond repair and beyond repair is required for the replacement of historic building materials. So that documentation that it's deteriorated beyond repair would be a window survey, photographs, a historic record that shows that the resource or the material cannot be retained and repaired and must be replaced. If an adverse effect to historic properties is unavoidable, the programmatic agreement requires consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office. I'm going to go through these slides rather quickly because we typically try to avoid any project that results in adverse effect. But if you have one, the only way to resolve adverse effects legally in accordance with the National Historic Preservation Act is to do so through the development, execution, and implementation of a memorandum of agreement, which outlines agreed upon measures that the federal agency, the responsible entity, and the SHPO will take to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effects resulting from the undertaking. This document has to be developed in consultation with the SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, and any interested parties. This is just a typical timeline for what a memorandum of agreement takes. So it adds time to every process, and it generally adds additional cost to every project. So you would consult with the State Historic Preservation on the finding of adverse effect. They have 30 days to review and presumably concur. They may try during that window to identify ways that you could avoid adverse effect. They may ask you to seek other project plans or specifications, and it is your responsibility to take those into consideration. Ultimately, if the SHPO concurs with a finding of adverse effect, you then have to notify the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. They have 15 days to respond, and the requirements of that notification are stipulated in Federal Register. You are also required at this point to notify the public and interested parties of the adverse effect and solicit ideas for ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate. There is no set calculation for this process. That it's not like wetland banking where you just run a formula and determine how much money you pay. Every MOA, every historic preservation mitigation is unique to the site, and the public and interested parties are encouraged to be creative in their response and development of mitigation measures. You meet collectively to determine those measures. You draft the memorandum of agreement to outline the roles and responsibilities of who will implement those measures. You distribute those agreements for review and comment. Ultimately, you execute them and you can move forward. As you work through resolving adverse effect, it's important to take into consideration the time frame. Oftentimes, mitigation might take longer than the project itself that you're funding. The federal funding source and the federal responsible entity will have to keep the project open for the length of the mitigation. You need to determine who will pay for the mitigation measures, make sure that it can be covered either by federal or private funds, depending on the results of consultation. You need to identify projects that are most beneficial to historic preservation and the public. You'll want to stay away from private interests or isolated benefits. You have to ensure that mitigation measures are agreed upon by all parties, particularly the State Historic Preservation Office, before including them in an MOA. And you need to make sure that the resources and administration available, that everyone has the resources and administration available to implement the mitigation measures, because if you don't, you're still not compliant with the National Historic Preservation Act. Examples of mitigation can be resource specific. So the direct recordation or documentation of a resource. This is typically completed for historic buildings that are being proposed for demolition or alteration. You can do a booklet or other publication on the history of significance of the resource. You can do signage or an interpretive kiosk. Those things are all specifically related to the resource being impacted or affected by the federal project. There's also alternate mitigation, where you can focus your positive historic preservation resources on something not affected by the specific resource. So you could survey another National Register eligible district or property and perhaps move forward with National Register nomination. You could do historic preservation education and technical assistance workshops. You could provide a comprehensive preservation plan for the community. You could do bricks and mortar repairs on other local historic properties. Digitize archives for public use. These are just examples to show positive preservation actions that could be completed as part of mitigation. So when should you consult all parties? So once you have completed your area potential effects, your identification and evaluation, and you've gone through that effects assessment process, you'll need to start preparing your consultation. You want to consult with parties when you know the full scope of work of your project, including plans, specifications, access areas, borrow sites, etc. After you've defined your area potential effects, as we talked about at the beginning of step 2, when you've completed all of your step 2 identification and evaluation of cultural resources within your APE, and when you've determined your effects assessment, so when you've concluded step 3. You want to do this approximately 3 months prior to any estimated construction start date or earlier, as consultation may take time. Who are interested parties? For our CDBG and CDBG-DR projects, the IEDA Historic Preservation Specialist, in lieu of the State Historic Preservation Officer, is the primary interested or consulting party. We also encourage consultation with local historic preservation commissions in the city or county where your project may be located, local historical societies, tribes with an interest in the area as found through the HUD portal, particularly for projects that have ground disturbance associated with them, and any other party identified as having an interest in that federal project. Preparing your consultation documentation. You'll want to include some form of a cover letter or narrative description of what your project is and what your role is and how you came to your finding. In iowagrants.gov, you will need to select one of those federal findings we talked about as a drop-down. No historic properties, no adverse effect, adverse effect. You want to provide through uploads in Iowa grants all of your identification and evaluation documents. Inventory form, including individual buildings or districts, current condition photographs, any historic images. Even if a building or district is listed in the National Register, current condition photographs are still required for your submittal. If new construction, you'll need archaeological figures to show previous use, land use, or archaeological resources. Even surveys, any of your identification and evaluation documents would need to be uploaded. Assessor's webpage for the parcel or the property is helpful. And then the architect engineered renderings, including as much detail as possible in order to convey that the proposed project meets the standards or will not result in adverse effect to historic properties. In general, we're going to talk more specifically about how to submit your consultation to IEDA through our iowagrants.gov. But this list is the same list as if you were to send things to other interested parties, perhaps tribes or a historic preservation commission. You're going to want to convey the project, talk about how you made your finding, and provide your identification and evaluation documents. It's important that all interested parties, including the tribes, have the same level of information and are treated consistently in consultation. Consultation should be an open process where both the responsible entity and the interested parties can discuss options, make suggestions, and ultimately agree on a finding. Interested parties may be able to provide technical assistance or conditions related to specific projects, such as conformance with Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties or reviewing archaeological survey work. So if a tribe, can provide technical assistance on the results of an archaeological survey, they should have the opportunity to do that. Consultation with IEDA does not replace the potential need to consult with other federally recognized Native American tribes or tribal preservation offices. We require that you use the programmatic agreement in the HUD database for the consultation process for federal tribes. No consultation note that the tribal consultation must be on the city or county letterhead from the chief elected official and not from a grant administrator. It's very important with the HUD designation of federal responsible entity that the federal agency is consulting with the tribe. CDBG projects are often designed to avoid adverse effects. However, when such effects can't be avoided, IEDA works with the responsible entity to consult directly with the SHPO and other interested parties to resolve adverse effects. So how do we specifically document Section 106 compliance when it comes to our environmental review record? For environmental assessments, if another federal agency, such as the State Revolving Loan Fund, USDA, FEMA, has completed the Section 106 compliance on the exact same project, all you need to do is add that documentation from the other agency's consultation, provide the relevant information in your checkbox, and complete your environmental review record for your environmental assessment. You do not, for this scenario, when another agency has taken lead, you do not need to submit an iowagrants.gov form. If no other federal agency is involved, you're going to need to complete a status report known as compliance forms in iowagrants.gov. You'll open a Section 106 form. You'll upload all of your relevant documentation that we've talked about, such as scope of work, inventory forms or archaeological surveys, copies of tribal or other consultation, signature authorization to ensure that I know that you have the authority to make that submittal on behalf of the responsible entity, and any other maps or information that would be helpful for my review. You would submit that form through Iowa Grants. The IEDA Historic Preservation Specialist will review it, and if everything is correct, will approve the form. Once approved, go ahead and print or screenshot that approval and add it to your environmental assessment. Update your checklist accordingly, indicating that the IEDA HPS has reviewed and approved the process. Complete your environmental review record and submit your EA. Likewise, if you have a project that is categorically excluded subject to 58.5, which would be like our housing rehab or our downtown revitalization program, then your environmental review record will be completed prior to individual house or site reviews. Therefore, the following ERR checklist language should be submitted in your environmental review record and your release of funds, which you can then process through Iowa grants. Here you're indicating that at the time of your environmental review, you do not know which sites are participating, but prior to construction, each individual site will be reviewed and submitted to the IEDA Historic Preservation Specialist. After you have release of funds and you've identified those specific houses or sites that will be in your project area, and you've completed steps 2 and 3 of the Section 106 process, then you'll start your Section 106 Tier 2 compliance form in Iowa grants. You'll upload all relevant documentation such as scope of work, inventory forms, archaeological surveys, copies of tribal or other consultation, signature authorization, etc. You'll submit the form for review. IEDA's Historic Preservation Specialist will review, and if everything is correct, will approve. Once approved, the project can proceed. For your Tier 2 submittal, remember to select No for PA exempt if you are submitting evaluation documents, inventory forms, etc. This will open up other fields for you to select your federal finding. No historic properties affected, no adverse effect. That is required to be able to approve a form. Be sure to complete all relevant fields and read the instructions. Photographs must be integrated into Iowa site inventory forms. Separate documents will no longer be accepted and will be sent back to correcting status. IEDA requests PDF documents for all uploads, and all submittals must either have a signature authorization form where the elected official authorizes the grant administrator to make submittals on their behalf, or you can use the individual request for comment signed by the city official per property. This helps document that you have the signature authority to make the federal finding for Section 106 compliance. So a couple of frequently asked questions or tips that I've noticed over the years. What is a site inventory number? In the state of Iowa, when a property has been previously evaluated, it will be issued a specific number. Its 2 digits are the county code, followed by an assigned 5 digits. This number is in the city list or the previous Iowa site inventory list. If your property has one of these numbers, you'll need to include it in the Iowa site inventory form, and you'll need to mark your form as supplemental at the top of the form. I've included here a screenshot of the top of an Iowa site inventory form. If you have an existing site inventory number, you would put it here and you would check supplemental. Oftentimes I see review and compliance numbers entered in this space. That is incorrect. This is a review and compliance number is another federal agency's action has been assigned a number. If that is the case, you can put that number here under RNC number, but that is not the site inventory number. You'll want to be sure that if your property has a site inventory number, the 2 digits dash 5 digits, that you put that in the proper field in iowagrants.gov. What do I do if a property was previously evaluated? Previous evaluations are good for 5 years. If a property was evaluated within the last 5 years and looks the same as the photos in the evaluation, you can use that form in your consultation, or apply any exclusion from the PA for recently evaluated properties. If it's more than 5 years old, you need to complete a new Iowa site inventory form. You can state the previous evaluation was conducted and what your determination is based on that prior recommendation. You will also want to make sure that you provide any documentation of things that have changed over time, age, integrity, material changes, and you'll want to provide up-to-date current photographs of the property. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions about this presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.